The judge's gavel echoed through the packed courtroom as the prosecution's star witness pointed directly at me. Your Honor, Samantha Rodriguez is a clear and present danger to public safety. She's reckless, unpredictable, and has caused more property damage in 6 months than most people do in a lifetime. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I sat there in my orange jumpsuit, handcuffed to the metal chair, watching as my entire life was reduced to a highlight reel of explosions, shattered windows, and smoking debris. The media had painted me as Phoenix's most dangerous vigilante. The city wanted me locked away forever. But they hadn't seen the footage yet. The footage that would change everything. 6 months earlier, I was just another security guard working the graveyard shift at Meridian Industrial Complex on the outskirts of Phoenix. Nothing glamorous. Just me, my thermos of coffee, and endless hours of watching empty hallways through grainy security monitors. At 28, I'd already bounced between 3 different security companies, and each one had the same complaint. I asked too many questions. Rodriguez, you're not a detective, my supervisor Tony Castellanos would say whenever I'd flag something suspicious. Your job is to watch, report, and stay out of trouble. But trouble had a way of finding me anyway. The first incident happened on a Tuesday night in March. I was doing my usual rounds when I noticed something off about the chemical storage facility in Building C. The external temperature readings were spiking, but the automated systems showed everything as normal. Any reasonable person would have filed a report and waited for the day shift to handle it. I wasn't reasonable. I grabbed the emergency toolkit and headed straight for Building C. The closer I got, the stronger the smell of sulfur became. By the time I reached the main storage area, I could hear a low hissing sound coming from behind the reinforced walls. The digital displays still showed green across the board, but my gut told me something was catastrophically wrong. I called it in, but dispatch said the earliest they could send a technician was Thursday morning. Thursday was 2 days away. 2 days for whatever was building up behind those walls to reach critical mass. That night, I made the decision that would define the next 6 months of my life. I overrode the safety protocols and manually vented the chemical storage system. The explosion that followed blew out every window in a 3-block radius and sent a plume of orange smoke into the desert sky that could be seen from downtown Phoenix. When the hazmat teams arrived, they found elevated levels of hydrogen sulfide that would have created a toxic cloud capable of killing everyone within a mile radius if it had been allowed to build for another day. But all anyone cared about was the $2.3 million in property damage and the fact that I had violated about 15 different safety regulations. Meridian Industrial fired me the next morning. The local news ran the story with the headline, "Rogue Security Guard Destroys Chemical Plant." The comments section called me everything from a terrorist to a mentally unstable loose cannon. 3 weeks later, I was working security at Westfield Shopping Plaza when I noticed the patterns again. Small things that didn't add up. Maintenance crews that worked at odd hours but never seemed to actually fix anything. Delivery trucks that arrived during off-peak times with no corresponding invoices. Security cameras that mysteriously malfunctioned whenever these crews showed up. I started keeping detailed logs, taking photos, documenting everything. The more I dug, the clearer it became that someone was using the mall's infrastructure to move something they shouldn't be moving. But when I brought my concerns to mall management, they told me the same thing Tony had. Stick to watching monitors and leave the investigating to professionals. The professionals weren't paying attention. On a Friday night in April, I was monitoring the east parking garage when I saw them. 6 men in maintenance uniforms wheeling large containers toward a service elevator that was supposed to be out of order. The containers were unmarked, but they moved with the careful precision of people handling something dangerous. I should have called the police. I should have followed protocol. Instead, I followed them. The service elevator took them down to the sub-basement level that wasn't supposed to exist according to the official building plans. I took the stairs, moving as quietly as possible through corridors that smelled of dampness and something else, something chemical and sharp that made my eyes water. What I found in that sub-basement changed everything. Rows upon rows of metal drums filled with substances I couldn't identify, but the hazard symbols told me everything I needed to know. Toxic, flammable, corrosive. enough chemical agents to contaminate half the city's water supply. And in the center of it all, a timer counting down, 47 hours, 23 minutes, 15 seconds. I tried calling 911, but there was no cell service in the sub-basement. I tried the emergency phone, but the line was dead. Every official channel I could think of led nowhere. So I did what I always did. I improvised. The next 2 hours were a blur of disarming timers I barely understood, neutralizing chemical compounds with whatever cleaning supplies I could find in the janitor's closets, and slowly, carefully, moving drum after drum out of that underground facility. By the time the sun came up, I had cleared out enough of the cache to prevent a citywide disaster. But when the authorities finally arrived, all they saw was a security guard covered in chemical residue, standing in the middle of what looked like a crime scene, with no way to prove that any of it had been there before I showed up. The FBI investigation lasted 3 months. During that time, the media narrative shifted from possible terror plot foiled to unhinged security guard creates false emergency. Expert after expert testified that the chemical combinations I described were impossible, that the timeline didn't make sense, that there was no evidence of any larger conspiracy. The surveillance footage that could have proven everything had mysteriously corrupted. The drums I'd moved were never found. The 6 men in maintenance uniforms had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only fake work orders and forged credentials. By the time the investigation concluded with no charges filed, I was unemployable in the security industry. Background checks turned up my name associated with words like, quote, unstable, paranoid, and prone to creating dangerous situations. Property management companies wouldn't hire me. Even private security firms wanted nothing to do with the woman who had caused millions in damage chasing shadows. But the shadows were real, and they were getting bolder. July brought the third incident. I was working a temporary gig as a night janitor at Copper Canyon Office Park when I started noticing the patterns again. This time it was the HVAC system, unauthorized modifications to the air circulation infrastructure, chemical residue around the intake vents, and most telling of all, the building's occupancy records showed that 3 of the largest tenants had quietly moved their operations to other locations over the past month. The people in charge weren't evacuating because of scheduled maintenance. They were evacuating because they knew something was coming. I spent 2 weeks mapping every modification to the HVAC system, tracing the source of the chemical contamination, and documenting the steady exodus of major tenants. When I finally pieced it all together, the picture was terrifying. Someone had turned the building's air circulation system into a delivery mechanism for something that would affect everyone who worked there. This time, I didn't bother with official channels. I didn't file reports or wait for permission. I went straight to the source and began systematically dismantling every unauthorized modification I could find. The explosion that followed made the previous 2 look like fireworks. When the smoke cleared, Copper Canyon Office Park was a twisted skeleton of steel and concrete, and I was standing in the parking lot covered in debris, holding the remnants of a timer that had been counting down to 0. The news crews arrived before the fire department. By evening, every major network was running the story of the Phoenix bomber, a former security guard turned domestic terrorist who had now destroyed her 3rd major facility in 4 months. The arrest warrant was issued the next morning. The charges included domestic terrorism, destruction of federal property, and conspiracy to commit mass murder. The evidence against me was overwhelming. I had been present at all 3 locations, I had access to restricted areas, and security footage showed me tampering with critical infrastructure just hours before each explosion. What the evidence didn't show was the timer I'd found, or the chemical weapons that had been neutralized, or the thousands of lives that had been saved because those buildings were empty when they should have been full. The manhunt lasted 2 weeks. Phoenix Police, FBI, ATF, and Homeland Security, all hunting for the woman they believed was planning to bring down the entire city. My face was on every news channel, every social media feed, every wanted poster, from Scottsdale to Tucson. They found me in an abandoned warehouse in South Phoenix, surrounded by the evidence I'd been collecting for months. Documents proving the connection between all 3 incidents. Chemical analysis reports showing exactly what had been prevented. blueprints revealing the true scope of what someone had been planning. But evidence only matters if people are willing to believe it. And by that point, the narrative was already set. Samantha Rodriguez wasn't a hero who had prevented 3 catastrophic attacks. She was a dangerous extremist who had finally been caught before she could finish whatever twisted plan she'd been working on. The preliminary hearing was a media circus. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, split between those demanding I be locked away forever and a smaller group insisting I was being framed. The prosecution painted me as a calculating terrorist who had spent months perfecting her techniques. The defense struggled to explain how someone planning mass destruction would keep detailed evidence of her own innocence. Through it all, I kept waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Why would a terrorist document her own crimes so thoroughly? Why would someone planning attacks work so hard to minimize casualties? Why would a domestic extremist go to such lengths to preserve evidence that could exonerate her? But those questions never came. Instead, the focus remained on the damage, the fear, the very real danger I supposedly represented to every person in Phoenix. The prosecution's case was simple and compelling. Look at the destruction she's caused. Look at the fear she's created. Look at the threat she poses to public safety. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. My public defender, Janet Morrison, was overwhelmed and underprepared. She believed in my innocence, but believing and proving are 2 different things. Every piece of evidence that supported my version of events had been conveniently destroyed or had mysteriously disappeared. Every witness who might have corroborated my story had either vanished or suddenly developed selective amnesia about what they'd seen. As the trial date approached, it became clear that unless something dramatic changed, I was going to spend the rest of my life in federal prison for the crime of preventing 3 mass casualty events that officially had never existed. That's when Detective Marcus Chen from Phoenix PD made a discovery that would change everything. While reviewing evidence for an unrelated case, he found something the FBI had missed. Something that had been hiding in plain sight for months, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Hidden in the metadata of a routine traffic camera backup, Detective Chen found 18 minutes of footage that the original investigation had overlooked. Footage that showed exactly what had really happened in those final moments before each explosion. Footage that would prove, beyond any doubt, who Samantha Rodriguez really was. But first, the prosecution would have their chance to convince 12 jurors that I was the most dangerous person ever to walk the streets of Phoenix. The trial began on a scorching September morning, with protesters lining the courthouse steps and news vans blocking every available parking space. Inside Courtroom 4B, Prosecutor Angela Whitman stood before the jury with the confidence of someone who had never lost a case this high profile. Ladies and gentlemen, over the next 2 weeks, you will hear about a woman who systematically targeted critical infrastructure across Phoenix. You will see evidence of deliberate sabotage, calculated destruction, and a pattern of behavior that endangered thousands of innocent lives. Whitman clicked her remote, and the first slide appeared on the courtroom's display screen. Aerial footage of the Meridian Industrial Complex, twisted metal and shattered concrete stretching across several city blocks. March 15th, Samantha Rodriguez, employed as a security guard for exactly 4 months, single-handedly caused an explosion that registered on seismic equipment 12 miles away. Her excuse? She claimed she was preventing a gas leak that mysteriously no one else detected. Quote, "The next slide showed the Westfield shopping plaza, its east wing partially collapsed. Emergency vehicles scattered across the parking lot like toys." April 28th. Rodriguez, now working under an assumed reference, infiltrated restricted areas and triggered what officials initially believed was a terrorist attack. When questioned, she insisted she was stopping something that, conveniently, no evidence supports ever existed. The final slide was the most devastating. Copper Canyon Office Park reduced to a smoking crater, the surrounding buildings evacuated for blocks in every direction. July 19th. The defendant didn't just cause an explosion this time. She created what hazmat specialists described as the most complex chemical incident in Arizona state history. 3 city blocks had to be evacuated. The cleanup cost exceeded $8 million. Whitman turned back to the jury, her voice dropping to a near whisper. The defense will try to convince you that these were heroic acts. They will paint Samantha Rodriguez as a misunderstood savior who prevented disasters that somehow left no trace of their existence. But the evidence tells a different story. The evidence shows a woman whose delusions of grandeur led her to create the very emergencies she claimed to be preventing. My defense attorney Janet Morrison did her best in her opening statement, but I could see the uphill battle written on every juror's face. How do you prove a negative? How do you demonstrate that disasters that left no physical evidence were real threats that had been neutralized? The prosecution's case unfolded with surgical precision over the next 5 days. Expert witnesses testified about the impossibility of the chemical combinations I described. Engineers explained why my version of events violated basic laws of physics. Psychiatrists discussed the psychological profile of someone who might create elaborate fantasies to justify destructive behavior. Dr. Patricia Hawkins, a forensic psychologist with 20 years of experience, spent an entire afternoon explaining my supposed pathology to the jury. Ms. Rodriguez exhibits classic signs of what we call hero syndrome, she testified. Individuals with this condition create emergency situations specifically so they can be the ones to resolve them. They crave the validation and attention that comes from being perceived as a savior. Quote, the prosecution played security footage from all 3 incidents, carefully edited to show only my actions without the context that would have explained them. The jury watched me override safety systems, disable security protocols, and handle dangerous materials without proper authorization. Without the audio, without the full timeline, without the evidence of what I was actually preventing, every action looked like sabotage. Whitman was particularly effective when cross-examining the few witnesses Janet had managed to find. Maria Santos, a janitor at Copper Canyon who had seen some of the unauthorized HVAC modifications, suddenly couldn't remember specific details under oath. Kevin Wright, a maintenance worker at Meridian who had noticed unusual chemical odors weeks before the explosion, claimed his memory was fuzzy about the timeline. One by one, my potential witnesses either recanted their previous statements or discovered they had been mistaken about what they thought they had seen. The pattern was so consistent, it was almost artistic. But the most damaging testimony came from someone I had never met. Dr. Raymond Foster was introduced as a consulting engineer who had reviewed all the technical evidence in the case. Tall, distinguished, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he spoke with the authority of someone who had spent decades in his field. I have examined Ms. Rodriguez's claims extensively, he testified. The chemical combinations she describes are scientifically impossible. The timeline she presents defies basic engineering principles, and the threat scenarios she alleges simply could not have occurred given the safety systems in place at all 3 facilities. Dr. Foster's PowerPoint presentation was a masterclass in technical certainty. Detailed diagrams showed why my version of events was physically impossible. Chemical equations proved that the substances I claimed to have neutralized couldn't have existed in those combinations. Engineering schematics demonstrated that the modifications I described would have been instantly detected by automated monitoring systems. In my professional opinion, he concluded, Ms. Rodriguez's explanations are the product of either deliberate deception or severe psychological dysfunction. No engineer with 40 years of experience would believe these scenarios could occur in the real world. The jury hung on every word. Here was someone who spoke their language. Facts, science, measurable reality. Not wild stories about shadowy conspiracies and invisible threats, but concrete proof that I was either lying or delusional. Janet tried to challenge Dr. Foster's credentials during cross-examination, but his resume was impeccable. MIT graduate, former Department of Energy consultant, published author of 3 textbooks on industrial safety. He had been qualified as an expert witness in over 200 cases and had never had his testimony successfully challenged. What Janet couldn't have known was that Dr. Foster's consulting firm had been secretly retained by the same shell company that had been funding the chemical weapons operation I'd been dismantling. But that connection wouldn't be discovered until much later, long after the damage had been done. By the end of the prosecution's case, the narrative was ironclad. Samantha Rodriguez was a disturbed individual who had convinced herself she was saving people while actually putting them in danger. The explosions weren't prevented attacks. They were attacks, carried out by someone who had lost touch with reality. The media coverage reflected this certainty. Legal analysts on every network agreed that the defense had an impossible task ahead of them. How do you create reasonable doubt when the defendant's own actions had caused such obvious and documented harm? The Phoenix Tribune ran a feature article titled "The Mind of a Domestic Terrorist," exploring the psychology of individuals who believe they're fighting for a greater good while actually causing massive destruction. I became a case study in radicalization, a cautionary tale about what happens when delusions of heroism spiral out of control. Meanwhile, Detective Chen was working nights in the Phoenix PD's Digital Evidence Unit, following a hunch that had been bothering him since the investigation began. Something about the timing of the incidents, the precision of the cover-up, the way every piece of exonerating evidence had disappeared so completely. Chen had seen enough real conspiracies in his 15 years on the force to know that when evidence vanishes this systematically, it's usually because someone with significant resources is making it vanish. But proving that would require finding something the professionals had missed. He started with the traffic cameras. Phoenix had one of the most comprehensive traffic monitoring systems in the Southwest, with cameras positioned at nearly every major intersection. If the chemical weapons operation was as large as I claimed, there should have been some record of the logistics involved. Chen spent weeks going through thousands of hours of footage, looking for patterns that others had dismissed as routine. Delivery trucks that appeared in multiple locations. Vehicles that deviated from their registered routes. Personnel who worked for companies that didn't exist when their backgrounds were checked. What he found was a network of coordinated activity that spanned months and involved dozens of people. But it was all circumstantial, all open to interpretation. All easily dismissed as the overactive imagination of a cop who had watched too many conspiracy theory documentaries. Then, on a Thursday night in late August, Chen discovered the backup files. Phoenix's traffic management system automatically created redundant copies of all camera footage, stored on servers that most people had forgotten existed. The backup system had been installed after a data corruption incident 5 years earlier, but it operated independently of the main surveillance network. While the primary footage from the nights in question had been corrupted or mysteriously deleted, the backup files remained intact. 18 minutes of high-definition video that showed exactly what had happened in the moments before and after each explosion. Chen watched the footage 3 times before he fully understood what he was seeing. Then he picked up his phone and called Janet Morrison. "You need to see this," he said. "All of it. Tonight." The meeting took place in Chen's office at 11 p.m., long after the courthouse had emptied, and the media had gone home to file their stories about another day of damning testimony against the Phoenix bomber. Janet arrived expecting another disappointing lead, another witness who would ultimately change their mind or disappear before trial. What she found instead was footage that would force everyone to reconsider everything they thought they knew about Samantha Rodriguez. The first video showed the Meridian Industrial Complex on the night of March 15th. But this camera had captured something the investigation had missed. At 11:47 p.m., 43 minutes before my arrival, 6 figures in hazmat suits had entered the chemical storage facility through a service entrance that didn't appear on any of the official building plans. The second video was even more revealing. Westfield Shopping Plaza, April 28, 3:15 a.m. The same 6 figures, now clearly visible, wheeling containers through the east parking garage toward the service elevator. But this time, the camera had captured their faces when they briefly removed their masks. The third video was the smoking gun. Copper Canyon Office Park, July 19th, just after midnight. The hazmat team, emerging from the building, loading sealed containers into a van with government plates, driving away exactly 17 minutes before I arrived for my shift. Chen had found proof that everything I had claimed was true. There had been a coordinated operation to weaponize Phoenix's infrastructure. There had been chemical weapons hidden in those buildings. And there had been a systematic effort to cover up the evidence while framing me for the explosions that occurred when their plans were disrupted. But proof and justice are 2 different things. The trial was already in motion. The media narrative was set, and powerful people had invested too much in the official story to let it change now. Chen and Janet knew they had 24 hours to figure out how to present this evidence in a way that would be believed, not dismissed as fabricated or irrelevant. Because if they failed, the real terrorists would remain free while I spent the rest of my life in prison for stopping them. Janet Morrison burst through the courthouse doors at 6:30 a.m., laptop bag clutched against her chest, and Detective Chen trailing behind her with a sealed evidence box. The security guards barely had time to process them through the metal detectors before Janet was sprinting toward Judge Harrison's chambers. "Your Honor, I need an emergency motion to introduce new evidence," she announced to Judge Harrison's secretary, who was still setting up her coffee maker for the day. 20 minutes later, Janet stood before Judge Catherine Harrison, Detective Chen beside her, with the backup footage queued on his department-issued laptop. "Ms. Morrison, you understand that we're 3 days into presenting the defense case. The deadline for new evidence submissions was..." "Your Honor, this footage proves my client is innocent." "Not probably innocent, not technically innocent on a technicality. Actually innocent. These videos show the real perpetrators." Judge Harrison, a 20-year veteran of the bench who had seen every possible legal maneuver, raised an eyebrow. "That's a significant claim, Counselor." Chen cleared his throat. "Your Honor, I'm Detective Marcus Chen, Phoenix PD. I discovered this evidence while conducting a parallel investigation into organized crime activities. The footage clearly shows unknown subjects placing chemical devices in all 3 locations before Ms. Rodriguez arrived. The judge studied the chain of custody documentation Chen had prepared. Everything was proper, everything was legitimate, but the timing was suspicious enough to raise questions. "I'll review the evidence on camera. If it's genuine and material to the case, I'll consider allowing it. But, Ms. Morrison, if this is some desperate attempt to derail the prosecution's case with manufactured evidence..." "It's real, Your Honor, every frame." 2 hours later, Judge Harrison emerged from her chambers, looking like someone who had just watched the world turn upside down. The footage was authentic, verified by 3 independent digital forensics experts she had called in for emergency consultation. The chain of custody was clean, and the implications were staggering. But introducing the evidence would require calling Detective Chen as a witness, which would open up questions about how Phoenix PD had missed this footage during their original investigation. It would raise uncomfortable questions about the FBI's competence, the media's rush to judgment, and the possibility that someone with significant influence had been orchestrating the cover-up. Judge Harrison spent the lunch recess in closed-door conferences with attorneys from both sides, representatives from the FBI, and emergency legal advisors from the State Attorney General's office. By 2 p.m., the courthouse was swarming with federal agents who had arrived to, quote, "review the chain of custody on Chen's evidence." Special Agent Victoria Nash, the FBI's lead investigator on my case, made it clear that the Bureau had serious concerns about the newly discovered footage. "This evidence raises significant questions about the integrity of ongoing federal investigations," she told Judge Harrison during a sealed hearing that Janet wasn't allowed to attend. "We need time to verify its authenticity and determine how it was overlooked during our original review." What Agent Nash didn't mention was that the backup traffic camera system Chen had accessed was classified under a federal infrastructure protection protocol. The footage he had discovered was technically considered national security intelligence, which meant its use in a civilian trial could be restricted under the Patriot Act. By 4 p.m., emergency motions were flying from both sides. The prosecution demanded immediate forensic analysis of Chen's evidence, claiming it could have been digitally manipulated. The defense insisted that delaying the introduction of exonerating evidence violated my constitutional rights. Federal attorneys argued that the footage contained sensitive information about infrastructure vulnerabilities that couldn't be made public. Judge Harrison found herself at the center of a legal storm that reached far beyond her courtroom. Phone calls were coming in from the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, and congressional oversight committees that wanted to understand how a local police detective had uncovered evidence that the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force had missed. The media picked up on the chaos immediately. By evening, news reports were speculating about mystery evidence that could change the entire case. Legal experts debated whether the trial would be delayed, moved to federal court, or declared a mistrial due to prosecutorial misconduct. But inside the Maricopa County Jail, I knew none of this was happening. I sat in my cell watching the local news coverage, which focused entirely on the courtroom drama without explaining what the new evidence actually contained. That night, Janet finally got permission to visit me and explain what Chen had discovered. "Samantha, there's footage, clear, undeniable footage of other people placing devices in those buildings before you arrived. We can prove you were trying to stop attacks, not carry them out." For the first time in months, I felt something other than despair, but Janet's expression told me the victory wasn't guaranteed. "There's a problem. The FBI is claiming the footage might be classified. They're arguing that showing it in open court could compromise national security by revealing surveillance capabilities or infrastructure vulnerabilities." The legal battle over the footage consumed the next week. Federal attorneys filed motion after motion, attempting to have the evidence sealed or transferred to a classified court proceeding. They argued that the backup camera system Chen had accessed was part of a counterterrorism surveillance network that couldn't be exposed without damaging national security. Janet fought back with her own motions, citing my constitutional right to present exonerating evidence in my defense. She brought in First Amendment lawyers who argued that classifying evidence of government incompetence violated the public's right to know. Civil liberties organizations filed amicus briefs supporting my right to a fair trial. The real breakthrough came when Chen made a discovery that changed the entire dynamic of the case. While reviewing the federal government's arguments for classifying the footage, Chen noticed something odd about the surveillance system they were trying to protect. The backup camera network they claimed was part of national security infrastructure had been installed by a private contractor, Sentinel Security Solutions. Chen ran a background check on Sentinel Security Solutions and discovered that the company was a subsidiary of a larger corporation called Phoenix Strategic Industries. When he dug deeper into Phoenix Strategic Industries, he found connections to 3 other companies: the chemical supplier that had provided materials to Meridian Industrial, the maintenance contractor that had worked on Westfield's HVAC system, and the engineering firm that had designed Copper Canyon's air circulation infrastructure. The same corporate network that was arguing the footage should be classified had been involved in all 3 locations where the attacks were planned. Chen brought this information to Janet on a Friday afternoon, just hours before Judge Harrison was scheduled to rule on whether the footage could be admitted as evidence. "This isn't just about proving Samantha is innocent," Chen explained. "This is about exposing a conspiracy that goes all the way to the top. The people trying to suppress this evidence are the same people who were planning the attacks." Janet stared at the corporate structure diagrams Chen had prepared, tracing the connections between companies that had seemed unrelated during the original investigation. "If we can prove this conspiracy exists, it doesn't just exonerate Samantha, it exposes everyone involved, including the people who have been trying to bury the evidence." But proving a conspiracy would require resources Janet didn't have and time that was running out. Judge Harrison had made it clear that she wouldn't delay the trial indefinitely while the defense conducted what amounted to a parallel investigation into corporate malfeasance. The solution came from an unexpected source. Sarah Brennan, an investigative journalist with the Arizona Republic, had been following my case since the beginning. Unlike most of the media coverage, which had focused on the sensational aspects of the Phoenix bomber story, Brennan had been quietly investigating the inconsistencies in the official narrative. She had noticed the same patterns Chen had found: witnesses who changed their stories, evidence that disappeared, corporate connections that didn't make sense. When Chen's discovery about Sentinel Security Solutions became public through court filings, Brennan saw the bigger picture immediately. Working through the weekend, Brennan and her team traced the corporate ownership structure back to its source. Phoenix Strategic Industries was owned by a private equity firm called Desert Capital Holdings. Desert Capital Holdings was controlled by a trust fund managed by the law firm of Patterson, Webb & Associates. And Patterson, Webb & Associates represented the interests of 3 of the most powerful families in Arizona politics. The conspiracy wasn't just about chemical weapons or terrorist attacks. It was about land development, water rights, and billions of dollars in government contracts that would be awarded based on how the city responded to infrastructure threats. Brennan's investigation revealed that the planned attacks were designed to create enough fear and chaos to justify massive security expenditures and infrastructure rebuilding projects, all of which would be awarded to companies controlled by the same private equity network that had been funding the operation. I was never supposed to stop the attacks. I was supposed to be the scapegoat who would be blamed for them after they succeeded. But stopping the attacks had forced the conspirators to improvise, to frame me for causing the very disasters I had prevented. And, in their haste to control the narrative, they had made mistakes that Chen and Brennan were now exposing. On Monday morning, Brennan's exposé hit the front page of every major newspaper in Arizona. The Phoenix Conspiracy, How Corporate Interests Framed an Innocent Woman, laid out the entire network of connections that linked the planned attacks to some of the most influential people in state politics. By noon, the Arizona Attorney General's office had launched an independent investigation. By evening, federal prosecutors were preparing indictments against 12 individuals, including Dr. Raymond Foster, whose expert testimony against me had been purchased by the same network he was secretly working for. Judge Harrison called an emergency hearing for Tuesday morning. The courtroom was packed with journalists, federal agents, and lawyers, representing so many different interests that they ran out of seats at the counsel tables. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Harrison announced, "in light of recent developments and new evidence that has come to light, I am suspending this trial pending a comprehensive review of all materials related to this case." The prosecution's case collapsed completely when Agent Nash admitted that the FBI had been aware of the backup footage, but had been instructed not to pursue it by superior officers who were themselves under investigation. Whitman, who had built her entire career on never losing a high-profile case, found herself explaining to reporters how she had unknowingly prosecuted an innocent woman while the real criminals sat in the gallery watching. But the most dramatic moment came when Dr. Foster was arrested during the lunch recess, led out of the courthouse in handcuffs while cameras rolled, and the very same media outlets that had called me a terrorist scrambled to rewrite their narratives. The story was far from over, but for the first time in 6 months, I wasn't the one wearing handcuffs. 3 weeks later, I walked back into courtroom 4B as a free woman, but this time I wasn't the defendant. The charges against me had been dropped entirely, and now I sat in the gallery watching as the real conspirators faced justice. The transformation was surreal. The same reporters who had painted me as a domestic terrorist were now describing me as a heroic whistleblower and the woman who exposed Arizona's biggest political scandal. The same courthouse steps where protesters had demanded my execution now hosted rallies calling for systemic reform of law enforcement and corporate oversight. But the most important moment was yet to come. Judge Harrison had agreed to hold a special hearing where Detective Chen's footage would be shown in its entirety, not as evidence in a criminal trial, but as part of the public record that would document exactly what had happened during those 6 months. The hearing was unlike anything the Arizona court system had ever conducted. Representatives from every major news network were present, along with federal investigators, state legislators, and families of the 37 people who would have died if the attacks had succeeded. Janet Morrison, no longer burdened with an impossible defense case, had transformed into something resembling a prosecutor herself. She stood before a packed courtroom prepared to present evidence that would expose the full scope of the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed my life. "Your Honor, what we're about to see is not just footage of prevented terrorist attacks. This is documentation of a coordinated effort by powerful interests to weaponize fear for profit, regardless of the human cost." The first video began playing on the courtroom's main display, but this time it included audio that had been recovered from enhanced forensic analysis. The footage from Meridian Industrial Complex showed the 6-person hazmat team, but now the enhanced audio revealed their conversations as they placed chemical devices throughout the facility. "Base station, this is Team Alpha. Package 1 is in position. Timer set for 72 hours. Copy, Team Alpha. Confirm civilian evacuation protocols are disabled. Affirmative. Security systems show normal operations. No alerts will trigger until it's too late." The courtroom was silent except for the sound of breathing and the occasional gasp as people realized they were watching the planning stages of what would have been mass murder. The enhanced footage showed the terrorists checking building occupancy schedules, ensuring maximum casualties during the planned attack window. But the most chilling moment came when one of the team members removed his mask and spoke directly to the camera, apparently unaware that the backup system was recording. Dr. Foster's analysis was correct. The chemical combination will create a toxic cloud covering approximately 4 square miles. Estimated casualties range from 800 to 1,200, depending on wind patterns. The man speaking was identified by federal investigators as Marcus Webb, the son of one of the partners at Patterson Webb and Associates. He had been using his family's connections to coordinate the entire operation, while maintaining his cover as a graduate student in chemical engineering. The second video from Westfield Shopping Plaza revealed even more disturbing details. The enhanced audio captured conversations about the mall's upcoming anniversary celebration, which would have brought thousands of families to the exact location where the chemical weapons were being planted. The anniversary event should draw about 3,000 people, one terrorist explained to his team. Maximum media impact, maximum public terror. The governor will have no choice but to declare a state of emergency and approve the infrastructure spending package. The footage showed them sabotaging safety systems, disabling emergency alerts, and even placing fake maintenance notices to prevent anyone from accessing the areas where they had hidden their devices. But most importantly, it showed them leaving a clear exit strategy, a detailed plan for framing me as the perpetrator once the attack succeeded. Rodriguez has been flagged as a person of interest by building security. Her employment record shows a pattern of paranoid behavior. Once the attack succeeds, she'll be the perfect suspect. The courtroom erupted when this audio played. Here was proof, in the conspirators' own words, that I had been chosen as a scapegoat months before the attacks were even attempted. But the third video, from Copper Canyon Office Park, contained the revelation that changed everything about how people understood the scope of the conspiracy. The enhanced footage revealed a seventh person directing the operation from a vehicle parked outside the building. Federal facial recognition software had identified this person as Special Agent Victoria Nash, the same FBI agent who had led the investigation into my supposed crimes. Nash wasn't just covering up the conspiracy after the fact, she had been coordinating it from the beginning. The audio from this video captured Nash giving detailed instructions about timing, target selection, and evidence disposal. She knew exactly when the attacks would occur, she knew exactly how many people would die, and she knew exactly how to ensure that the investigation would lead to me instead of the real perpetrators. Once Rodriguez is arrested, we'll have 48 hours to clean up all physical evidence before anyone asks the right questions. Foster's testimony will convince the jury she's delusional, and the backup footage will never see daylight because it's part of classified infrastructure. But Nash had made one critical error. She didn't know that Detective Chen had access to the backup system through a separate Phoenix PD investigation. When she ordered the primary surveillance footage destroyed, she left the one copy that would ultimately expose the entire conspiracy. The revelation that a federal agent had been orchestrating terrorist attacks sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. Within hours, FBI Director James Crawford was announcing a complete internal investigation of the Bureau's Phoenix field office. Within days, congressional oversight committees were demanding hearings. But the most important outcome was what the footage revealed about the attacks themselves. Enhanced forensic analysis of the videos had allowed experts to reconstruct exactly what would have happened if I hadn't intervened. The chemical combinations the terrorists had assembled were far more sophisticated than anyone had initially realized. They hadn't just been planning random attacks. They had been developing weapons-grade chemical agents capable of creating catastrophic environmental damage. Dr. Elizabeth Torres, an expert in chemical weapons who testified at the hearing, explained the full implications of what had been prevented. The combination of industrial solvents and biological agents hidden in these facilities would have created what we call a "fax effect." The initial chemical release would have contaminated water supplies, agricultural areas, and residential neighborhoods across a 70-mile radius. Conservative estimates suggest that 37 deaths from direct exposure would have led to thousands more from long-term environmental contamination. The 37 victims Dr. Torres referenced weren't hypothetical casualties. They were real people with names and families. People who had been specifically targeted because their daily routines brought them into contact with the locations where the attacks were planned. Jennifer Hawkins, a single mother who worked the early shift at a coffee shop near Meridian Industrial. She would have been driving to work exactly when the chemical cloud reached street level. Michael Chen, Detective Chen's younger brother, who jogged through the park adjacent to Westfield Shopping Plaza every morning before his shift as a paramedic. Sarah Martinez, an environmental scientist who would have been collecting water samples from the canal system that ran beneath Copper Canyon Office Park. The footage had captured terrorists discussing these specific individuals by name, confirming that the attacks weren't random violence but carefully planned murders, disguised as infrastructure targeting. As the hearing concluded, Judge Harrison made a statement that captured the magnitude of what had been revealed. This court has witnessed evidence of a conspiracy that goes beyond terrorism, beyond corporate malfeasance, beyond political corruption. We have seen documentation of a systematic attempt to murder innocent people for financial gain, carried out with the assistance of federal law enforcement, and covered up through the persecution of the one person who tried to stop it. But even as the truth emerged, the damage from the months of false accusations couldn't be completely undone. My name had been cleared legally, but the court of public opinion moves more slowly than the justice system. Death threats from people who still believed the original narrative continued arriving at my temporary address. Job applications were still rejected when employers searched my name online and found the archived news stories calling me a terrorist. The conspiracy had been exposed, but its effects on my life would last far longer than the trials of the people who had orchestrated it. The financial settlements from the wrongful prosecution helped, but money couldn't restore the relationships that had been destroyed, the reputation that had been shattered, or the 6 months of my life that had been consumed by a nightmare I had never deserved. What the settlements could do was fund the foundation I established to help other people who had been falsely accused of terrorism or wrongfully prosecuted in high-profile cases. The Samantha Rodriguez Defense Fund provided legal assistance, forensic analysis, and investigative support to people whose cases shared the same patterns of evidence, suppression, and media manipulation that had nearly destroyed my life. The first case the foundation took on was that of Thomas Martinez, a security guard in Denver who had been accused of planning an attack on a federal building after he reported suspicious activity to his supervisors. The parallels to my own case were unmistakable. Another whistleblower framed by the same people he had tried to warn. As the final hearing concluded, and the media circus finally began to disperse, I realized that clearing my name was only the beginning. The conspiracy that had targeted me was part of a larger pattern of corruption that reached far beyond Arizona, beyond the specific companies and individuals who had been arrested. Somewhere, other security guards and maintenance workers and ordinary citizens were noticing things that didn't add up, reporting suspicious activity, trying to protect people who would never know their names. And somewhere, other conspirators were looking for new scapegoats, new ways to profit from fear, new innocent people to frame for crimes they were planning themselves. The footage had saved my life and exposed the truth, but it had also revealed how easy it was for powerful people to manipulate the justice system, the media, and public opinion. The real question wasn't whether I was innocent. That had been proven beyond doubt. The real question was how many other innocent people were sitting in prison cells, labeled as dangerous, while the real criminals walked free. 2 years later, I stood in front of the newly constructed Phoenix Memorial Garden, watching as families placed flowers at the markers bearing the names of the 37 people who would have died if the attacks had succeeded. The memorial wasn't just for victims. It was for the lives that had been saved by someone brave enough to ask the right questions at the right time. But the ceremony wasn't why I was there. Hidden among the crowd of officials, families, and media representatives was someone I had been tracking for months, someone whose face I recognized from the enhanced footage that had changed everything. Marcus Webb had been released on bail pending his appeal, a legal technicality that allowed him to walk free while his lawyers argued that the enhanced audio from the backup footage had been obtained through illegal surveillance. His father's law firm was still fighting the convictions on procedural grounds, claiming that the evidence against their clients had been gathered without proper warrants. What they didn't know was that Webb had never stopped planning attacks. The Phoenix conspiracy had been dismantled, but the network behind it was larger than anyone had realized. Webb wasn't attending the memorial to pay respects. He was conducting surveillance for the next phase of their operation. I had spent 2 years building the skills necessary to track people like Webb. The Foundation had given me access to private investigators, digital forensics experts, and former federal agents who believed that the official investigation had barely scratched the surface of the conspiracy. Together, we had been mapping a network of corporate interests that stretched across multiple states, involving infrastructure projects worth billions of dollars. The memorial service ended with Governor Patricia Walsh announcing new legislation that would provide protection and support for whistleblowers who report suspected terrorism. The Samantha Rodriguez Protection Act would ensure that people who tried to prevent attacks wouldn't be prosecuted for the very crimes they were trying to stop. It was a victory, but a hollow one. Laws only work when they're enforced by people who aren't corrupted by the same interests they're supposed to be fighting. As the crowd dispersed, I followed Webb to his car, maintaining enough distance to avoid detection while keeping him in sight. He drove toward the industrial district on the east side of Phoenix, the same area where the Meridian complex had been rebuilt after the explosion I had caused to prevent the chemical weapons attack. Webb's destination was a warehouse facility operated by Desert Logistics Solutions, another subsidiary of the same corporate network that had been behind the original conspiracy. But according to my research, Desert Logistics had been disbanded after the trials. The fact that Webb was meeting someone there meant that the network was still active, still planning, still looking for new opportunities to profit from manufactured terror. I parked across the street and activated the surveillance equipment I had learned to use during my 2 years of investigating the conspiracy's remaining elements. The directional microphone could pick up conversations from over 300 yards away, and the camera system could capture facial recognition data on anyone entering or leaving the facility. What I recorded over the next 4 hours would lead to the largest domestic terrorism investigation in Arizona history. Webb was meeting with Dr. Amanda Foster, Dr. Raymond Foster's daughter, who had inherited her father's chemical expertise along with his willingness to develop weapons for the right price. Also present were Special Agent Nash's former partner, Agent David Kruger, who had avoided prosecution by cooperating with federal investigators while secretly maintaining his connections to the conspiracy. The audio I captured revealed that the Phoenix attacks had been a test run for a much larger operation. The conspiracy wasn't just about local infrastructure contracts. It was about creating a national crisis that would justify massive increases in security spending across multiple states. Phoenix proved the concept works, Dr. Foster explained to the assembled group. We can create coordinated attacks that appear to be domestic terrorism while actually being controlled by corporate actions. The key is ensuring that we have appropriate scapegoats identified before we begin implementation. Agent Kruger provided details about federal security protocols that would be implemented after the next wave of attacks. Homeland Security has prepared response plans that will essentially federalize all infrastructure security in the Southwest. Every contract, every security system, every emergency response protocol will be controlled by federal agencies that award contracts based on our recommendations. But the most chilling revelation came when they discussed target selection for the expanded operation. Schools, Webb said matter-of-factly. Elementary schools in suburban areas with high media visibility. The chemical agents will be designed to cause maximum fear with minimal actual damage, but the public won't know that until after the emergency legislation is passed. They weren't planning to actually harm children. The chemicals would be designed to create dramatic but non-lethal effects that would terrify parents and voters. But the psychological impact would be devastating, and the political response would give them control over security contracts worth tens of billions of dollars. I had heard enough. But calling the FBI wasn't an option when one of their agents was coordinating the conspiracy. Calling local police wasn't viable when the investigation would likely be taken over by federal authorities who couldn't be trusted. I needed to find a way to expose the conspiracy that didn't rely on law enforcement agencies that had already been compromised. The solution came from Sarah Brennan, the investigative journalist who had exposed the original conspiracy. Over the past 2 years, she had been building a network of independent journalists, cybersecurity experts, and legal advocates who could investigate and expose corruption without relying on official channels. Samantha, if you have evidence of ongoing terrorist planning, we need to be extremely careful about how we handle it, Brennan explained when I contacted her that evening. These people have already proven they can manipulate federal investigations and media coverage. We need to release the information in a way that makes it impossible for them to suppress or discredit. Brennan's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of releasing the audio recordings to a single news outlet or law enforcement agency, we would simultaneously release them to every major news organization in the country, along with complete documentation of the corporate connections that linked the new conspiracy to the original Phoenix attacks. But we also needed to ensure that the people planning the attacks couldn't simply disappear or destroy evidence once they realized they had been exposed. That meant we needed to gather additional evidence before making the recordings public. Over the next 2 weeks, I conducted surveillance on all 4 conspirators, documenting their meetings, recording their conversations, and tracking their movements. The Foundation's resources allowed me to hire professional surveillance experts who could gather evidence that would be admissible in court. What we discovered was a conspiracy that extended far beyond the 4 people I had initially identified. The network included state legislators, federal contractors, and corporate executives from companies involved in emergency response, infrastructure security, and chemical manufacturing. The planned attacks would target 6 different states simultaneously, creating a regional crisis that would justify implementing the federal security protocols that Agent Kruger had described. Each attack would be designed to appear like the work of domestic terrorists, while actually being controlled by corporate interests that would profit from the response. The total value of the contracts that would be awarded after the staged attacks exceeded $40 billion. For that much money, the conspirators were willing to terrorize millions of people, traumatize thousands of children, and frame dozens of innocent security guards and maintenance workers who might discover their plans. But the most disturbing element of the conspiracy was how they planned to avoid the mistakes that had led to the exposure of the Phoenix operation. They had developed detailed profiles of potential whistleblowers at each target location, and they had prepared evidence that would immediately implicate these individuals in the attacks they were actually trying to prevent. I recognized several names on their target list: security guards who had reported suspicious activity at their facilities, maintenance workers who had noticed unauthorized modifications to building systems, even a few journalists who had been investigating corporate connections to infrastructure contracts. All of these people were being set up to take the blame for attacks they would actually be trying to stop, just as I had been framed for the Phoenix incidents. On March 15th, exactly 2 years after the first explosion at Meridian Industrial Complex, we released everything. The audio recordings went to every major news network simultaneously. The corporate documentation was uploaded to secure servers operated by investigative journalism organizations. The surveillance footage was provided to clean federal agencies that had been verified as having no connection to the conspiracy. But most importantly, we sent detailed warnings to every potential whistleblower on the conspirators' target list, along with legal resources and protection strategies that would help them avoid the trap that had nearly destroyed my life. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, federal agents were arresting Webb, Dr. Foster, and Agent Kruger. Within days, congressional investigators were announcing hearings into corporate influence on federal security policy. Within weeks, legislation was being introduced to prevent private companies from profiting from emergency response contracts. But the most satisfying moment came when I received a phone call from Jennifer Martinez, a security guard in Albuquerque who had been on the conspirators' target list. "Ms. Rodriguez, I just wanted to thank you. I noticed some strange activity at my facility last week, and after receiving your warning, I knew exactly what to do. I documented everything, contacted the right people, and made sure I couldn't be framed for what I was actually trying to prevent." Martinez had discovered chemical storage modifications at her facility that matched the pattern from the Phoenix attacks. But instead of handling the situation alone, she had worked with federal agents who had been cleared by the independent investigation, ensuring that both the threat was neutralized and the real perpetrators were identified. The FBI found enough evidence to arrest 12 people involved in planning attacks across the Southwest. They said if you hadn't warned me about their tactics, I probably would have ended up in prison while the real terrorists walked free. 6 months later, I testified before Congress about the need for systematic reforms to prevent corporate interests from manipulating federal security policy. The hearing room was packed with the families of people who had been saved by whistleblowers who had learned from my experience. Detective Chen, who had been promoted to head Phoenix PD's corporate crime unit, testified about the investigative techniques that had uncovered the original conspiracy. Sarah Brennan discussed the role of independent journalism in exposing corruption that traditional law enforcement had missed or ignored. But the most powerful testimony came from the people who had been targeted for framing by the expanded conspiracy: security guards, maintenance workers, and ordinary citizens who had been selected as scapegoats for crimes they would never have committed. The conspirators didn't just plan to commit terrorist attacks, explained David Park, a maintenance supervisor from Denver who had been on their target list. They planned to destroy innocent people's lives as part of covering up their crimes. They were willing to send dozens of innocent people to prison for life to protect their profit margins. The congressional hearings led to the most comprehensive corporate accountability legislation in decades. The Corporate Terrorism Prevention Act created new agencies specifically designed to investigate connections between private companies and security threats, established protection programs for infrastructure whistleblowers, and implemented oversight mechanisms to prevent federal agents from participating in corporate conspiracies. More importantly, the legislation created the National Whistleblower Database, a secure system that would allow people who noticed suspicious activity to report it without fear of retaliation or framing. The database was designed to identify patterns of corporate manipulation and provide early warning systems for potential attacks. 2 years after the congressional hearings, I was invited to speak at the FBI Academy about recognizing and investigating corporate-sponsored terrorism. The same agency that had once hunted me as a domestic terrorist was now training its agents to identify the tactics that had been used against me. Standing before a classroom of new federal agents, I looked out at faces that reminded me of Detective Chen, people who believed in justice and wanted to protect innocent lives. But I also knew that somewhere in law enforcement, there were still people like Agent Nash, willing to betray their oath for money and power. The most dangerous terrorists aren't the ones who act out of ideology or religion, I told them. The most dangerous terrorists are the ones who commit acts of violence for profit, because they have the resources to cover up their crimes and the connections to frame innocent people for what they've done. I explained how corporate conspiracies use the very systems designed to protect people, law enforcement, media coverage, public fear, to advance their own interests. How they identify and target potential whistleblowers before they can expose the truth. How they prepare evidence to frame innocent people as part of their operational planning. Your job isn't just to investigate crimes after they happen. Your job is to recognize when powerful interests are manipulating the system to create crimes that serve their purposes. And your job is to protect the people who are brave enough to speak up when they see something wrong, even when those people are being labeled as dangerous by everyone else. After my presentation, a young agent approached me with a question that brought everything full circle. Ma'am, what would you say to someone who's noticed suspicious activity but is afraid that reporting it might make them a target for retaliation or framing? I thought about the question for a moment, remembering the fear I had felt during those long months when everyone believed I was a terrorist. But I also thought about the 37 people whose lives had been saved because someone had been willing to ask the right questions and take the right actions, regardless of the personal cost. I would tell them that being called dangerous by people who profit from fear is better than staying silent while innocent people die. I would tell them that the truth has a way of surfacing, even when powerful people try to bury it. And I would tell them that there are people who will fight for the truth, even when it seems like the whole world is against them. The Memorial Garden in Phoenix now includes a new section dedicated to whistleblowers who have prevented terrorist attacks. Small bronze plaques bear the names of security guards, maintenance workers, and ordinary citizens who noticed something wrong and chose to act, despite the personal risks. My name is there too, but it's not the one that matters most to me. The plaque that means everything to me is a simple bronze marker that reads, "In memory of the 37 people who lived because someone was willing to be called dangerous." Every year on March 15th, I visit that memorial and think about the people whose names are not engraved in bronze because they never had to die. Jennifer Hawkins, who is now a grandmother. Michael Chen, who became a paramedic supervisor and trains other first responders. Sarah Martinez, who leads an environmental protection agency that monitors industrial facilities for signs of tampering. They don't know my name, and they don't need to. They're alive, they're safe, and they're living the lives they were meant to live because someone was willing to be labeled as dangerous by people who profited from fear. That's not the ending anyone expected when they called me dangerous, but it's the ending that mattered. As I walked away from the memorial that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from Detective Chen. New case in Seattle. Corporate security contractor, suspicious chemical deliveries, maintenance worker asking questions. Sound familiar? I smiled as I read the message. The network we had built over the past 4 years, investigators, journalists, legal advocates, and reformed federal agents, had become something the original conspirators never anticipated. We had turned their own tactics against them, creating a system that could identify and expose corporate terrorism before it claimed victims. The Foundation now operated in 12 states, with field offices staffed by former law enforcement officers who specialized in corporate conspiracy investigations. We had prevented 8 major attacks, exposed dozens of smaller schemes, and helped establish legal protections for hundreds of potential whistleblowers. But more importantly, we had changed the conversation about what terrorism really looks like in America. The image of the dangerous terrorist was no longer just someone motivated by ideology or religion. It included corporate executives willing to murder innocent people for profit, federal agents willing to betray their oath for money, and respected professionals willing to provide expert testimony that they knew was false. The real victory wasn't that my name had been cleared or that justice had been served. The real victory was that somewhere in Seattle, a maintenance worker was asking questions about suspicious activity, and instead of being ignored or targeted for retaliation, that person would be protected, supported, and believed. They might even be called dangerous by the people who had something to hide, and that would be exactly the right thing to be called. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.